You've been wanting to dive into Byzantine history, and I think we have the perfect starting point with these excerpts from Timothy's A History of Byzantium.
Yeah, definitely. This deep dive should give you a solid grasp of this influential empire.
A civilization that spanned over 1,000 years. It's
A
incredible.
really pivotal empire.
It really is. And Timothy mentions how it's often misunderstood despite its huge impact.
Right in the preface, he points that out.
Which makes you think, why is this civilization that kind of bridges the ancient world and the medieval world and shapes so much of Europe? Why does it still feel a bit shadowy?
I think it's partly because it's such a long and complex history, and sources themselves are, well, unique.
Yeah, let's start with those sources. Timothy talks about how Byzantine writers really looked back to the Greeks and Romans as their models.
Yeah, they consciously followed in the footsteps of those classical historians like Herodotus and Xenophon, and of course
Big
Thucydides.
names.
Yeah, and they even wrote in Latin for a while, but then from the 5th century on, they shifted to this very particular style of Greek.
It almost sounds like they were trying to recreate the language of ancient Athens. He even points out that most Byzantines wouldn't have understood it.
Exactly. It was very deliberate.
It's like they're projecting this image of being the heirs to this timeless classical tradition.
Right. And that leads to this really interesting cast of historians. You've got Procopius in the 6th century, one of the earliest.
Okay.
And then you get this real flourishing later on with Constantine Porphyrogenitos and his circle in the 10th century.
Wow.
Then you have Sellos in the 11th and some really well-known ones like Anna Komnene and Nikitas Choniates in the 12th.
Those are the ones you always hear about?
Yeah, they are. And they mostly wrote annals, just straight up recording events or biographies, focusing on key figures.
Makes sense.
And that tradition continued right through the later Byzantine period.
So those are the more classical style histories. What about those chronicles that Timothy mentions?
Chronicles offer a different view. What's unique about them is how they try to bring together the whole story of the world from a Christian perspective, connecting everyday events with God's plan.
I see.
You have John Malalas in the 6th century. His chronicle starts with creation and goes all the way to Justinian.
Ambitious.
Yeah, but maybe the most important chronicler is Theophanes the Confessor. He was writing in the early 9th century.
Timothy really emphasizes how important he is, especially for understanding the 7th and 8th centuries.
Rightly so.
Yeah.
But he also makes it clear that Theophanes had a strong bias.
Yeah, he was pro-icon.
Right. The whole iconoclastic controversy, that debate over religious images, really shaped his viewpoint. So you have to be aware of that when you're reading him. But luckily, his work was so valuable that other writers continued it later on, carrying this story forward.
That's pretty amazing.
It is. You also have the hagiographies.
Yeah, the lives of the saints. They were probably more about inspiring faith than strict historical accuracy, right?
That's right. They can give us some clues about religious beliefs and social values. But their main purpose was to showcase the holiness and miracles of the saints.
Okay, so we have these written sources, but what about physical evidence? What does Timothy say about archaeology?
Archaeology could really bring Byzantine life to light. But, as Timothy points out, early excavations often focused on earlier periods, the classical or even prehistoric times. And sometimes that meant they missed or even damaged Byzantine stuff.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, thankfully things are changing, but a lot's probably been lost. And what's surprising is that there haven't been many large-scale digs in Constantinople itself.
You'd think that would be the first place to look.
You would, but modern Istanbul is a huge, bustling city. Preserving Byzantine remains hasn't always been the priority. However, as Timothy suggests, this means there are a ton of opportunities for future research.
It's good to end on a positive note.
It is. So let's move from the sources to the actual history. Timothy takes us to the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. We see the transition from the Roman Empire under Diocletian and Constantine. He makes the point that their reforms weren't a sudden revolution, but more of an evolution.
Okay, that's an interesting distinction. So they weren't just wiping the slate clean.
No, a lot of their changes built upon trends that were already happening in the 3rd century, which was a pretty chaotic time.
I can imagine.
And it's not always easy to say who was responsible for what, but together, their impact, along with a more stable period, really reshaped the empire.
One thing Timothy points out is how the emperor's position became much more elevated under Diocletian.
Yeah, that's a major shift. It contrasts with the idea of Augustus as the first among equals. Under Diocletian, you see all these elaborate court rituals, and the emperor is clearly set apart from everyone else.
So it's like going from a republic with a powerful president to a system that's more like a monarchy.
Exactly. And there were also some significant military reforms. Separating military command from civilian administration was a smart move. It helped to prevent powerful generals from challenging the emperor.
Yeah, makes sense.
It was all about professionalizing the army and preventing another 3rd century where ambitious generals were always fighting for power.
And what about the changes in the types of troops?
Right. The Limitani, the old border troops, became more localized, while the main fighting force became the mobile field armies, the conquistados, and cavalry became increasingly important.
It sounds like a more flexible and responsive military.
Yes, and Constantine also did away with the Praetorian Guard, replacing them with more loyal units like the Scoli.
Okay. Now, I have to ask about Diocletian's attempt to control inflation with that price edict in 301. It sounds like it backfired.
It did, pretty spectacularly. Diocletian thought greed was driving inflation, so he tried to set prices by imperial decree. It's a fascinating historical example of economic control. And the edict itself tells us a lot about prices in the economy at the time. But in the end, it couldn't be enforced and probably made things worse.
Okay. What about those tax and administrative changes, like the Eugatio Capitatio system?
Ah, yes. This system linked the amount of land you owned, the aegum with the number of workers, the caput for tax purposes. It was about taxing the land's potential productivity, not just the actual output. And the curialis, the local city council members, were personally responsible for making up any shortfalls in tax revenue.
That must have been a huge burden for them.
It could be crippling. Then you have Constantine and his support of Christianity. Timothy discusses the basilica becoming the typical design for churches.
Right. That's interesting how they adapted an existing Roman structure for a new purpose.
Absolutely. The basilica was a public building used for law courts and such. With its open central space and aisles, it was perfect for Christian communal worship.
Timothy mentioned some important early examples, like St. John Lateran and Old St. Peter's in Rome, and St. Apollinaire Nuovo in Ravenna.
Yes. And some basilicas also served as martyria. They housed the relics of martyrs and became pilgrimage destinations.
I can see how that would be significant.
Yeah, and Constantine didn't just build in Rome. He also launched major building projects in Jerusalem, especially the basilica, over what was believed to be Christ's tomb.
That must have had a huge impact on the development of Christianity.
Without a doubt. It made Jerusalem a central pilgrimage site, really shaping the religious landscape of the Christian world.
Moving on to the 4th century, Timothy introduces Theodosius the Great. And there's that interesting irony about how his administrative decisions led to the permanent division of the empire.
It really is ironic. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule a unified Roman Empire. But when he divided the administration between his 2 sons in 395, that split became permanent. Arcadius ruled in the east and Honorius in the west. And Timothy also notes that after Theodosius, most Eastern emperors were raised in the imperial court. They didn't have much direct military experience.
Interesting.
The century also saw that monumental shift from polytheism to Christianity becoming the state religion. And it wasn't just about changing religious practices. It was a fundamental change in how they viewed the world and dealt with those who believed differently.
A total transformation.
Yeah, polytheism, which was pretty tolerant of various gods and beliefs, was replaced by monotheism. And this new Christian orthodoxy became intertwined with the power of the Roman state. Eusebius of Caesarea was one of the first to really articulate this link between church and state under Constantine.
Timothy describes how that relationship solidified throughout the 4th century, to the point where being an Orthodox Christian was practically synonymous with being Roman.
That's right. He brings up the clash between Symmachus and Ambrose over the altar of victory as a key moment.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
Symmachus, representing the traditional Roman aristocracy, wanted to restore the altar of victory in the Senate House. It was a symbol of Rome's pagan past.
Right.
But Ambrose, the powerful bishop of Milan, was completely against it.
Yeah, he represented the growing power of the church.
Exactly. And when they finally removed the altar, it symbolized the triumph of Christianity.
We also see the authority of bishops increasing and the development of church hierarchy through councils like Nicaea and Constantinople.
And what's interesting is that Timothy points out that many of those early bishops came from the curial class.
Oh, those local elites?
Yeah, they often had the education and skills needed to become leaders in the church. So even though the imperial authorities were worried about this drain of talent from local government, it was a natural progression.
Interesting.
These councils were essential for defining Christian doctrine and establishing the church hierarchy.
And then you have the state trying to control society, keep things stable, by passing laws that practically tied people to their jobs.
Yeah, it's like early social engineering. These laws restricted the movement and occupations of people like the coloni, who were bound to the land, and members of crucial collegia like bakers and shipbuilders.
The state really wanted to make sure they had a stable workforce and tax base, didn't they?
Absolutely. But these laws were hard to enforce, which might mean society was undergoing significant changes, not just that the state was being controlling. It's something historians debate.
Okay, so we get to the 5th century and beyond, and the empire fragments even further after the permanent split.
Right. Things in the East and West start to diverge more and more. And what's fascinating is Timothy's observation about how local identities and languages began to emerge.
He gives the example of religious movements like monophysitism, which was rooted in these theological disputes about the nature of Christ. But you can also see it as reflecting these regional differences.
Exactly. It wasn't just a monolithic imperial culture anymore.
Then Timothy brings up Anastasios and Tsakhali in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. He pursued a more assertive policy, opposing the Ostrogoths and going to war with Persia.
And, of course, he built those impressive long walls to protect Constantinople.
Yeah, really focusing on defending the East.
He rebuilt fortifications after the Persian War, and those long walls were crucial for defending against threats from the Balkans. And his confrontational stance towards Theodoric and the Ostrogoths in Italy marked a clear separation of interests between East and West.
Okay. And in the 5th century, you have the rise of monasticism.
Yeah, and Timothy points out that monks were increasingly moving into cities.
It's not just about those isolated desert hermits anymore.
No, they became more involved in urban life, offering spiritual guidance, helping the poor, and founding monasteries in cities. These urban monasteries attracted wealthy patrons and became important social and religious centers.
It's quite a change.
It is. Now, moving on to the 6th century, we come to Justinian.
A major figure.
Definitely. Timothy emphasizes his ambition and the huge impact of his reign. And the end of the Akakian schism under his uncle Justin I was a significant event leading up to Justinian's rule.
What was the Akakian schism about again?
It had created a split between the Eastern and Western churches for decades. Justin Wingby found, I wanted to restore a Chalcedonian theological stance and reconcile with Rome, which laid the groundwork for Justinian to fully restore communion with the West. And this Chalcedonian position became a cornerstone of Byzantine orthodoxy.
Okay. And Justinian had a pretty impressive team around him, didn't he?
He did. Theodora, Belisarius, Narses, Tribonian. They were a really influential group.
They were essential for carrying out Justinian's ambitious plans.
Absolutely. From the legal reforms under Tribonian to the military campaigns led by Belisarius and Theodora's political influence.
And Timothy mentions how Justinian took action against non-Christians, potentially even closing Plato's Academy in Athens.
Yeah, his policies reflected a desire for a more uniformly Christian empire.
Even though the details of the Academy's closure are debated, it's still a significant moment.
Definitely. And it's interesting that some pagan scholars went to Persia for refuge, only to return later under a peace treaty.
And yet, even with these actions, intellectual life continued under Justinian.
Oh yeah. You have scholars like John Leidos.
His book on the magistracies sounds like a fascinating look into the bureaucracy of the time.
It is. It shows his deep knowledge of Roman history and his belief in a connection between the Roman Empire and Byzantium. And he even hints at some republican ideals, which is unusual for that period.
Now we move to the 7th and 8th centuries, a time of crisis and reorganization. The Arab conquests were a major turning point.
Definitely. The fall of Jerusalem in 634 was a huge shock.
A truly cataclysmic event.
Yeah. Timothy quotes Theophanes' account of the meeting between Caliph Umar and Patriarch Sophronios. You can really feel the sense of loss and the apocalyptic significance of those conquests in Sophronios' lament.
And even that symbolic exchange of clothing is very telling.
Yeah, it is. And what's surprising is that some Byzantine administrative practices continued under early Arab rule.
Timothy even mentions that Byzantine architects worked on the Great Mosque of Damascus.
It's remarkable. The new Arab rulers initially relied on the existing Byzantine systems, from administration and coinage to even using Byzantine artisans and builders.
That continuity is really unexpected.
It is. Timothy analyzes why the Arab conquests happened so fast. He talks about how the Byzantines were exhausted from fighting the Persians, the psychological impact of those losses, and maybe some internal problems.
Like the plague and Justinian's overspending?
Exactly. But he also points to archaeology, which suggests that daily life in the East didn't immediately collapse.
It's not like everything just fell apart overnight.
Exactly. While the Byzantine state lost tons of territory, the evidence suggests urban life and the economy carried on in many parts of the East, at least in the short term.
So it's a more complex picture than just total collapse.
Right. Then there's Constans II, who moved the capital to Syracuse and faced those rebellions.
A period of major instability.
Yeah. His focus on the West and trying to raise money led to a lot of unrest, while the Arab threat continued,
And he was assassinated in the end.
underscoring just how tense things were.
It's during this period that the theme system emerged, a major change in administration and the military.
It was a brilliant adaptation to the fact that the empire was much smaller. The remaining territories were organized into these bigger militarized provinces called themata.
Each with a strategos in charge.
Yeah, they had both military and civil authority. And the names of the early themes, like the Opsikion and Anatolikon, reflect their military origins.
Even the naval theme, the Karabiasiani.
Right, essentially a fleet-based military district. You also have the Ekloga, the legal code from the 8th century.
Timothy says it was meant to be a more practical guide, especially since some old laws were still in Latin.
It was all about making the law more accessible. It addressed the confusion from older, sometimes contradictory, laws, some still in Latin. It made changes to divorce laws, listed sexual offenses, and introduced things like mutilation as punishment.
It's amazing how much change there was in this period.
Yeah. Then, of course, there's the iconoclastic controversy. Timothy talks about how the use of icons increased by the 6th century and the debate over venerating them, which led to the ban under Leo III.
Yeah, some people were worried it was basically idolatry.
Exactly. In the early 8th century, Leo III officially banned icons, and they started destroying them. The iconoclasts believed that venerating images was idolatry, which the scriptures forbade.
Okay. And then you have a second wave of iconoclasm in the 9th century under Leo V and Michael II. This issue really divided Byzantine society, didn't it?
It did. It caused intense religious and political conflict. Leo V brought back iconoclasm, influenced by theological arguments. They deposed Patriarch Nikephoros, reaffirmed the pro-iconoclast Council of Hiera, and exiled people like Theodore of Studios who defended icons.
The turbulent time.
Yeah, but Theodore led a strong resistance movement, even reaching out to the Pope. Michael II might have been an iconoclast, but he was more moderate. He wanted to avoid widespread unrest.
And then there was the revolt led by Thomas the Slav during Michael II's reign.
It was a massive, complex uprising, drawing support from all sorts of groups. Iconophiles, people who'd lost out under the regime, even the Paulicians,
Who were they again?
a religious sect considered heretical. Thomas claimed to be Constantine VI to rally support and challenge the ruling dynasty.
An interesting tactic.
Yeah, he even allied with the Abbasid Caliph and besieged Constantinople. But in the end, the Bulgars helped crush his rebellion.
Okay, and then you have Cassia, the poet and nun. Timothy briefly mentions her.
Yeah. Her poetry and hymns give us a glimpse into the cultural and intellectual life of the time. It's a reminder that amidst all this religious and political turmoil, art and literature still flourished.
Right. And the 9th century ends with the end of iconoclasm.
A victory for icon veneration.
And the church's authority is strengthened.
Yeah. They really ramped up missionary efforts both within the empire and beyond, seeing Christianity as a civilizing force.
It's like they saw themselves as spreading civilization through Christianity.
Exactly. So then we come to the Macedonian dynasty.
The late 9th and 10th centuries. This is when Byzantine power and culture reached its peak, according to Timothy.
Yeah, Basil Dyer's reign marked the start of a very successful dynasty. His Kynerdian palace was incredibly opulent, with mosaics depicting his victories and showing how legitimate his rule was.
It was all about using art to convey power.
It was. And then you have Patriarch Photios.
A real intellectual powerhouse.
Yeah, he was involved in politics, supported missions to the Slavs, and was incredibly scholarly.
His Bibliotheca sounds amazing, like a massive review of hundreds of books.
It is. It gives us valuable insights into 9th century intellectual life, even though many of the books he described are lost now. And his support for missions among the Slavs had a huge and lasting impact on Eastern Europe.
Timothy also talks about the growing influence of the Anatolian military aristocracy under emperors like Nicephorus II, Phocas, and John Zimisces.
Yeah, powerful landowning generals were gaining more and more influence. It reflects a shift in the power structure.
Interesting.
And then there's the founding of Mount Athos.
That major monastic center.
It became hugely important for Orthodox spirituality, following the model of places like Mount Sinai and Mount Olympos.
We even get a glimpse into what ordinary Byzantine houses were like.
From the limited evidence and descriptions like the one from Michael Itallius in the 11th century, it seems they moved away from those grand Roman villas.
Towards more functional, multi-story dwellings, built with simpler materials.
Yeah, even wealthy guys like Itallius had complexes with chapels, grain mills, things a large household needed.
Okay. In the 10th and 11th centuries, we see Basil II trying to protect peasants' land from powerful landowners and monasteries.
He realized the threat posed by those big landowners, the Dynatoi. They were taking over peasant land, which weakened the army and the tax base.
He sounds like he was a pretty strong emperor.
He was. He introduced policies like the Elengion, making the Dynatoi responsible for unpaid taxes from poor peasants, and he removed that 30-year limit for recovering stolen land.
He was trying to help the little guy.
He was, though. How effective those policies were in the long run is debated. And in terms of church architecture, the cross and square style became the standard.
Timothy gives examples from Athens and the Argolid.
It wasn't just structurally sound, but it also had symbolic meaning, representing the cosmos and the divine.
It's amazing how much meaning they packed into architecture.
Yeah. Now we come to the Komnenian dynasty in the 12th century, a time of revival, but also more and more interaction with the West.
Starting with Alexios Akomnenos asking for military help against the Seljuks.
That was a turning point. He was hoping for some mercenaries, but it led to the First Crusade and all those unintended consequences.
Anna Komnena's account of the First Crusade arriving in 1096 is so interesting.
Yeah, she gives that unique Byzantine perspective. She thought the Western Knights were both morally questionable and strong fighters.
Bit of a culture clash.
It was, and her description of the soothsayers, interpreting that locust swarm as a sign the Franks would beat the Seljuks, shows how the Byzantines tried to understand these newcomers through their own beliefs.
And then John II Komnenos grants Venesis even more trading privileges.
He didn't like it, but he needed their navy, especially in the Mediterranean. It was a necessary compromise, even if it hurt Byzantine merchants.
Okay, but even with these pressures from outside, Byzantium was experiencing a period of growth and urban revival in the 12th century.
Yeah, cities in the Balkans and even parts of Asia Minor were flourishing. And Timothy mentions that annual fair at Thessaloniki described in the Timarian. It shows how important trade was and how interconnected the region was.
A real hub.
It was. But at the same time, the political map of the West was changing too. The rise of powerful monarchs and the Holy Roman Empire often led to conflict with Byzantine interests.
They couldn't escape those external pressures?
No. And then we reached the Paleologan dynasty and the fall of Constantinople.
That civil war in the early 14th century between Andronicus II and his grandson was devastating.
It really weakened the empire, drawing in Serbia and Bulgaria and contributing to Albanian migration. And Andronicus III's victory didn't solve the underlying issues.
Timothy also mentions the Great Meteoron Monastery and its ties to Serbian rulers.
Meteora became a significant monastic center.
Yeah.
And that fresco of St. Anastasia with the donor in Western clothing is a great illustration of the cultural exchange happening.
The 13th and 14th centuries were a tumultuous time in general, weren't they?
They were. Byzantium was increasingly at the mercy of events outside its control, especially after the Fourth Crusade and the creation of Crusader states.
But even then, there was still intellectual activity happening.
Yeah, Mistras, under Manuel II and Theodore Palaiologos in the early 15th century, became a center for preserving classical learning. And figures like Platon, with his love for Plato, played a key role.
Like a last burst of intellectual energy.
It was. And then there's Byzantium's lasting legacy, especially its influence on the Italian Renaissance.
Trade and the influx of Byzantine scholars played a major role, didn't they?
A huge role. They brought with them knowledge of Greek and access to classical texts. People like Manuel Chrysoloras were essential in reintroducing Greek to the West.
Timothy also highlights how important Platon's visit to Florence was and his talks about Plato.
It led to a renewed interest in Plato's philosophy, which became central to Renaissance thought. His influence on people like Cosimo de' Medici was profound.
And it wasn't just a one-way street.
No. Italians traveled to Byzantium to learn and collect manuscripts. And after Constantinople fell in 1453, even more scholars came to Italy, like Bessarion.
Their work really enriched the Renaissance.
Yeah, with translations and spreading Platonism, and Byzantine traditions survived within the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the Orthodox Church.
And then there's Russia's claim to be the third Rome.
Their conversion to Orthodoxy from Byzantium gave them a unique heritage. And then Ivan III married Zoe Paleologina, and the idea of Moscow as the successor to Constantinople took hold.
It's incredible how those Byzantine connections spread.
It is. And Byzantine art continued to evolve, especially on Crete. And as the Ottoman Empire weakened, some Balkan populations revived elements of Byzantine culture.
So even though the empire fell, its influence lived on.
It did. And Timothy wraps up by reminding us that while Byzantium was a deeply religious society, there was also a strong, practical, secular side to its culture.
Which is often overlooked.
It is. It helps us to see Byzantine civilization in a more nuanced way.
Okay, so as we finish up this deep dive, it's clear that the Byzantine Empire was long, influential, and multifaceted. From its roots in Rome through all its changes, challenges, and its fall, its impact on the world is still felt today.
What's fascinating is tracing those key periods of change. The reforms under Diocletian and Constantine, the resilience during Justinian's reign, and the cultural and political developments under the Macedonians and Comnenians.
It's a constant interplay of political struggles, religious developments, military power, and cultural achievements.
And all of that within this complex web of relationships with both East and West.
It's a lot to take in, but it makes you want to learn more.
It definitely does. So here's something to think about. Given how long and complex Byzantine history is, and how much focus there is on its religious aspects, what other least understood parts of its practical or secular traditions might hold surprising insights for us?
There's always more to discover.
Always.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Byzantine Empire. We'll be back soon with more fascinating explorations of history.
Until then, keep exploring.